Um, to begin with, let's talk about what is trauma and what it's not, and what is the diagnosis previously known as PTSD, probably was soon to be renamed fear circuitry disorder. Trauma, as Bessel van der Kolk would describe it, is an experience of being in a circumstance that is inescapable, and having the physiological reaction of arousal to that circumstance of abject fear, terror, helplessness, and you would understand that in the context of inescapability. So that the process with the experience in a traumatic event is this enormous response of the body-mind to fight, flight, or freeze. We are wired this way. We are made to respond to the saber-toothed tiger. We're made to run hard, run fast. We're made to stop our breathing as if the Bengal tiger was walking by and you didn't even want him to smell you. We're made to survive. So we have the capacity to upregulate and to arouse powerfully for the purpose of survival. What happens in a traumatic event doesn't necessarily become a post-traumatic stress disorder if the environment can support the individual in the downregulation of that upregulation. So if an individual is incredibly freaked out by something, incredibly frightened, incredibly scared in the moment, but has social support or an internalized method of calming the self, then the neurological experiencing of it actually has a different impact on the brain. So trauma impacts the brain. Trauma changes the brain, if you will. Trauma dysregulates the brain. Post-traumatic stress is the process whereby that dysregulation becomes hardwired in, so that there is a repetition, an uninvited, unbidden repetition of pieces that have to do with the experience of that trauma. The mind-body in the actual moment of trauma has an enormously powerful and exquisite defense called dissociation. Dissociation takes an enormously big experience and breaks it down into smaller, more manageable pieces. So it might be the voice of something, or for my Vietnam veterans, it was the sound of a helicopter. It might be actually a memory in and of itself. In a state of high arousal, the imprinting of the sound of that helicopter becomes a traumatic trigger later on down the road in the condition of PTSD. So dissociation, it's as if it fragments the experience into more manageable bits, the sound of it, the smell of it, the memory of it, the body memory of it, the visuals of it. And those pieces, like a shattered mirror, aren't always put together. And in fact, for the moment, for the purpose of surviving, they may need to be fragmented apart. And it's only in the aftermath of trauma and the conditions that arise in the aftermath of trauma that we begin to see whether something becomes a post-traumatic problem or not. And just because someone has had a trauma, again, doesn't mean that they're headed for PTSD. Who is at risk for PTSD? Interestingly, women are very much more at risk for PTSD than men. And men and women display PTSD differently. And that's an important piece of data. What is what would we recognize as PTSD? We have to think about PTSD really more, maybe a different frame would be neural dysregulation, that that this capacity to upregulate and fragment experience for the purpose of survival is somehow, the CD is scratched. You know, somehow in the computer there's a glitch there, and it's not, there isn't a closure of the circuitry. There isn't a coming back to ground, coming back to soothing, coming back to calm, and a narrative coherence about the experience. So Bessel van der Kolk would talk about the importance of, in treating trauma, this notion of creating a proximal space, if you will, that allows someone to navigate in this window of tolerance in terms of regulation. And I'm talking about affective, body-mind, neural regulation, somatic regulation. That there's this optimal window of tolerance, that if we're hypo or hyper, we're over or above that window of tolerance. When something has a post-traumatic flavor to it, the individual in question, the one who's suffering, has a profound tendency to employ avoidance mechanisms, avoidance maneuvers. And that avoidance maneuver is to essentially avoid being overwhelmed. So there's this pushing away from, I don't want to go to that. I don't want to get on a train because I was in a train wreck when I was a kid. I don't want to go down that street. I don't want to be in the street late at night. I don't want to go to that part of town. Whatever it is, there's that sort of terror response, fear response to the memory, which is that the survival mechanism in place is avoidance. I want to avoid that at all costs. But really what the issue is, I want to avoid the overwhelm of that state of dysregulation. So Bessel van der Kolk would talk about creating a kind of proximal space where the mind is neither needing to, or the individual is neither needing to engage in avoidance maneuvers or is overwhelmed. And he goes on to say that this is why antidepressants, for example, SSRIs, are particularly useful for helping retrain the neurology to what Buddha would call the middle path, the sort of the window of tolerance, this kind of place of calm where there is what I would call neural integration. There is sensory stabilization, there is a sense of groundedness, and there is access to the whole brain. PTSD is a dysregulation of the ability to access the whole brain, so that there's a cortical and a subcortical process, a left and a right hemispheric process. And in whole brain functioning, when someone is in that window of tolerance, the whole brain works. When we see PTSD symptomatology, what we often see is a term called alexithymia, which is don't have the language. So that the upregulation comes to about the midbrain, really, to the limbic system, and then is essentially driven back down into the body. So you don't have memory and don't have language, but a lot of dysregulation. Rage dysregulation, sleep dysregulation, addiction as a form of dysregulation. Those are all kinds of, if you think about symptomatology from the paradigm of regulation, it will really help you. The other thing that is true for people who are suffering from PTSD is that when that dysregulation is in place, it also impacts the capacity for self-reflection. And the opposite is true. Self-reflection drives regulation. So these are some important things to think about. Again, all PTSD symptoms are a function of neural dysregulation.